welcome everyone to this discussion, which I'm very happy to moderate, and thank you to the Paris Peace Forum to allow for that brainstorming on a quite challenging discussion. But it was good to see this morning head of state from every region of the world stressing the fact that we need to drastically increase the scale of finance. Climate finance, evidently, for developing and more vulnerable countries, for a low carbon and nature positive economy, while addressing the adverse effect of climate change, loss and damage, as well as financing other global public goods. And we heard Prime Minister of Barbados, Maya Motley, even widening the spectrum of what we should mobilize for, and was a key element not only on the source of finance, but of course on the allocation of this funding for much more than climate or biodiversity only. And I think it was a welcome addition of potential sources and contribution. We know that if we follow UNCTAD, that we will need to annually at least 2.5 trillion of financing for climate and development goals. We know that, and that have been a lot of discussion this morning about the domestic mobilization part and the 1 trillion that has to be found internationally. And we know that now we have only a fraction of what is needed, and that it could scale up very, very quickly to avoid the worst impact of climate change and the impossibility of the transition, and of course lessening, if possible, or limited the impact. I think the things that I think is coming in now more and more, even if it's still complicated, is that the cost of inaction, and only my community, I am an economist by training, was quite strong in demonstrating that it was always better to wait for action. I think it's no more the case that now the cost of inaction are higher and will be higher and higher and continue to raise. Yes, for the moment we are still failing. So it was good to see in Nairobi first, but in particular in Marrakesh, again this year, that the V20 Accra Marrakesh agenda, of course the declaration at the climate summit in Nairobi, and the Paris Pact for People and Planet all call to explore these new areas of resources in taxation option, just as a way to scale up the financing we are needing. Again, I said this morning and again a little later, we know it's a taboo. International taxation is a taboo, but so many things were taboo only a few years ago. I was talking with Kristalina Georgieva many times in the last 2 or 3 years, and SDR, which was proposed, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, is now a possibility, the transfer to SDR, and many other elements that, of course, considered impossible are now possible. So the idea to really to have additional financial resources at scale to support just an equitable transition while addressing inequalities, and that's very important that the element of inequalities is in there, because we know that even if inequalities is high between countries, we know that the progression of inequality within countries has been the most striking factor we have been observing in the last year, and in particular during the COVID years and after. So that's why there is an element of not only finding new resources, but as well a correction of the inequality we are contemplating, and which is actually the case. There are many examples of options that could leverage. There are pros and cons on almost everyone. You have been hearing, of course, of the plea for IMO, the maritime shipping levy, which is ongoing discussion at IMO. We know that $100 per ton of CO2, which is, of course, a small number, compared to the cost of transport per ton of, in a way, goods, could generate over 60 billion per year, at least if we follow the evaluation of the World Bank in 2022. Fossil fuel extraction levy could raise 150 billion a year at $6 per ton of CO2. Financial transaction tax, the EU-wide FTT, that's the European Commission evaluation, could have raised almost 80 billion Of course, but it was an old evaluation. I don't know, which we probably, it was very old, so it could be much bigger, again, considering what the level of transactions are now. The 0.1 levy in the US could generate, on average, 70 billion per year. Again, and the global minimum tax on billionaires, which I think we will have a sort of very active advocate for that in the discussion, equal to only 2% of their wealth, could generate a revenue close to 250 billion annually from less than 3,000 individuals. So, you know, when you hear these numbers and we are looking on when we can get this 100 billion and we are struggling to get there, and when we know that we need private capital and leveraging, but we know the public finance element to get even this leverage work. So it's good to start, at least, even if it's difficult, even if there are very different ideas. I didn't mention aviation taxation. I mentioned that earlier in the day. There were people that proposed, for example, a levy on business class tickets, which would not be a dramatic problem in terms of social injustice, frankly, but will bring a number of additional annual resources. So all this to say that it's good to discuss that with free minds and not being afraid of anything, because anyway, it's a brainstorming session. It will be a brainstorming task force, hopefully with government really involved, but many, of course, expert ability to try to understand the progressive or regressive impact of any tax, just to understand who could be the losers and who could be the winners, and then to design international taxation in a way that is positive. Looking at Amélie de Montchanin, there was already a big preparation from that by the lab before Paris. Of course, it has nurtured already and identified a number of people who have very good ideas on that. So I think we can build on what has happened. So to talk about this topic, we have today, well, Chrysoula, the Secretary of State for Development, will arrive a little later on. But we have already Meghna Abraham, which is there, which is Executive Director of CESR. CESR is an international non-profit organization that works to promote economic, social, and cultural rights around the world. And she's as well very working with the UN system, which is, of course, talking about taxation. So, Meghna, if you want, just the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. This is a really important panel and discussion. I think, as Laurence has pointed out, it's really exciting for people who've been working on tax for many years to actually finally see the issue of tax on the agenda, on the international agenda in a big way. And why is that? Besides, you know, I guess we could be technical nerds who just like that issue. It's really because I think it's critical to changing the narrative that we hear at the moment on the climate crisis. So we're constantly told, people who are campaigning for climate justice, looking at the impacts that the climate crisis is having all around the world, we're told, yes, it's a very sad situation, but the money is not there. And of course, the proposals then to bring the money in often rely on unlocking private finance and other issues which have their own challenges. And I think what the issue of taxation does is it tells us actually the money is there if governments are willing and have the political will to unlock those revenues. And in a context of growing inequality in the world, both within countries and inside countries, this could not be a more timely debate and discussion. I think that's the first thing I wanted to say. The other thing that I think I've been asked to look at is particularly the issue of how, in what way can international taxation bring more equity to this area. And I think there I wanted to bring up something that's quite fundamental, I think, for any new initiative or process to consider. And that is that when we must look at new and innovative taxes that could be imposed. Laurence mentioned many of them. But it is also important to look at something very fundamental that developing countries in particular have been highlighting for decades. This is a long fight by many, which is the way that the international tax rules fundamentally impair their ability to raise the revenues that they should be able to. And profit shifting, particularly by large multinationals, contributes to a huge amount of revenue being lost. And that revenue, I think we have to be clear, at the moment in time in which we are in, post-pandemic, post-crisis after crisis, that revenue is critical. And I want to highlight another dimension of it, which is really key. That is revenue that developing countries can raise themselves. They have the control, if the rules are changed, to be able to raise the revenues, and they don't have to wait for funds to be topped up, to be set up, to be redistributed. Not to say they're not important, but we know they are time-consuming and also expensive. And in that regard, and I'm sure other speakers, I'm sure Gabriel will also be talking about this a bit, that is the key thing when we look at these numbers. The estimates, the latest estimate from the Tax Justice Network is that we are losing $480 billion a year on basically these kinds of tax losses. If you can fill that hole, and we have to fill that hole, because anything additional we're talking about, it's like looking at a pot, and if the base of the pot has a massive hole and there's water coming out of it, just putting in a bit more money isn't going to fix that. So I think that's the first thing I would say from an equity perspective. Whatever is being constructed must look to the core system and must be complementary to the core system and support that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of process as well. The second aspect from equity isn't going to surprise any of us, but we are ultimately, whatever is being proposed has to be consistent with principles of climate justice and the human rights obligations that all states have. And what does that mean? First and foremost, it's a very simple thing. We can leave aside all the technicality, and that is the people who have contributed the least to the climate crisis, and we know that, is people in developing countries all over the world, are already paying a price for a crisis that they did not create. What we cannot have is any new measures of taxation must not lead to an increased burden on them. So who bears the burden of this kind of taxation, of any measure that's being proposed, is critical. Any taxation that is being proposed should be progressive and not regressive. It should not have disparate impacts on marginalized communities. And this, we know, is something that will have to be carefully managed, because there's a high danger that any new levies and taxes will be just passed on by industry to consumers, especially low-income consumers, who have the least ability to actually manage those impacts. But in addition to that, I think I just wanted to point out, this is where the principles of equity become very important, it's important that the agenda that we are talking about is one that is really developed with the full participation, it is complementary to, and it is building on what developing countries and NGOs and movements have been fighting for many decades now. And that is, I just want to point to some opportunities in that regard. There is a big movement right now looking at, in terms of wealth taxation, or looking at taxes effectively on various forms of profiteering. It's quite important that that is on the table, and we don't just look at sort of industry and other specific taxes, because this is a key resource that we have at the moment, and I'm sure, again, other speakers are going to talk about it. But we also, as I said, need to look at that reform of core tax rules. And there is a massive movement supported particularly by the African group of countries, but by many others, to have a process at the United Nations to develop a UN tax convention. And of course, that is the space for those negotiations. Any initiatives and processes should not try and replace that, should not try and complement, should not try and take over that space. But it is, as I said, key that those demands are seen as central, and whatever is happening here is complementary. So we're not developing more silos. That, there are already a lot of silos between these spaces, between climate groups, tax groups, development groups. We are breaking them in whatever comes forward. And the other aspect that I wanted to highlight there is more procedural, as I said as well. So I think in addition to who's at the table is critical. I think we're all aware of international negotiations right now, which are failing because there's a sense that governments, particularly governments in the West, are not listening to the voices of other countries. We just have to look at the debacle around the loss and damage negotiations to see that approach. And I think for anything to succeed, we have to start at a point, as I said, which acknowledges the responsibility of governments, of all governments, but particularly governments in the global north, to be ensuring that they are supporting the ability of countries in the global south to be able to raise revenues and to be able to direct them towards climate and other needs that they have. And there, the participation of developing countries in driving this agenda and the participation of NGOs and movements who have been working in this space is critical. The Global Alliance for Tax Justice, for example, is coordinating partners from around the world in this process, but there are many, many others, and it is key that they join this process. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Meghna. I think you did, in a very short way, define the criteria which we should be working in task force. So thank you. It's just a clear, in a way, roadmap to work. And I think, of course, there is a very, very evident issue that the President of Ghana mentioned, or President of Senegal, I don't remember, was that all these lost revenues, which I think would be a sort of the first evident thing to do. I will give the floor to Gabriel Zuckman. He's the director of the EU Tax Observatory, known for his research on tax evasion, wealth inequality, and international tax havens, which is exactly, well, it's not everything we are talking, but it's a very big part of what we are talking about. So, Gabriel, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I couldn't agree more with what Meghna Abraham just said. If we want to tackle the climate crisis, we have to tackle extreme wealth concentration. So the very wealthy emit much more carbon than the rest of the population per capita. And so it would be crazy to not start by taxing the super rich first and start by taxing lower income groups or lower wealth groups before them, especially given that the very rich have today significantly lower effective tax rates than the rest of the population. This is something that we show in the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024 that the EU Tax Observatory released a couple of weeks ago, where we show that globally, if you look at all the individual income taxes and wealth taxes that, when they exist, that are paid by global billionaires, all of that adds up to only in between 0 and 0.5% of their wealth. They just pay very little in individual income taxes, and very few countries have wealth taxes. And the reason this is the case is because when you're extremely wealthy, it's quite simple to structure your wealth such that this wealth is going to generate very little taxable income, or sometimes zero. It's something that has appeared very clearly, for instance, in revelations by the US media ProPublica in 2021, when they showed how people like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk in some years paid literally zero or almost zero individual income tax. But now there are a growing number of studies in many countries that show that this is a broader phenomenon. It just goes way beyond just a few case studies. And generally speaking, effective income tax rates for global billionaires are extremely low. The most direct way, the most powerful way to address that issue would be through a global minimum tax on billionaires. We know that global minimum tax rates are possible because we've been able to do such a thing for multinational companies. There's going to be, in a number of countries, starting next year, a 15% global minimum tax on multinational firms. In 2021, there was an agreement by more than 140 countries on such a minimum tax rate of 15% on multinational companies. Now, the rate is very low. The agreement has all sorts of problems, as we also explain in the Global Tax Evasion Report, but it has one big virtue. It demonstrates very clearly that it's actually possible to have global agreements setting a floor, putting a floor to how low tax rates can go on the most powerful economic actors, multinational companies yesterday, and tomorrow, hopefully, global billionaires and very wealthy people more broadly. In the Global Tax Evasion Report, we estimate that a modest 2% minimum tax on the wealth of global billionaires would generate about $250 billion in additional tax revenue globally. $250 billion from just about 3,000 taxpayers. We are talking about a very small number of taxpayers. We are talking about people for whom actually measuring their wealth is not very complicated. In most cases, these are stakes in large publicly listed companies for which you have clear market values. Even when their wealth derives mostly from private businesses, these are very large private businesses that are relatively easy to value. So it would not be very complicated to, first of all, compute their wealth, and second, deciding, collectively agreeing on this minimum justice principle that it's not okay that they pay 0 or 0.5%. It should be at least 2% of their wealth each year in taxes. $250 billion if you do that. Let me just talk briefly about another $250 billion that's here on the table for countries to grab. It's if we strengthened the minimum tax on multinational companies. Right now, there's a tax of 15%. Just 2 or 3 years ago, the discussion was about 20, 21%. We should reconnect with the spirit of the original discussions of 2020, 2021, and try to implement a 20% minimum tax rate on multinationals, free of loopholes, free of exemptions. If you do that, and we're still talking about low tax rates, 20% for multinationals when corporate tax rates are significantly larger than that in most countries, 2% for global billionaires, 2% of your wealth each year is really pretty low, but still this minimum tax on multinational companies, despite its low rate, would generate an additional $250 billion in revenue. So just to summarize, with 2 modest but important, crucial minimum tax rates, 2% on global billionaires, 20% on multinational companies, you can generate $500 billion in additional tax revenue each year globally, which is what the best estimates out there say that developing countries need in terms of additional public tax revenue to address the challenges of climate change. These would be 2 policies, 2 reforms that would be squarely focused on the very rich, on the main winners from globalization, on the economic actors who have most benefited from global economic integration, and yet have tended to see their tax rates decline. So I think it should be really the priority for policymakers in this area for the coming years. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. And again, the practical suggestion on how we should go for this element. I remember, of course, the famous comment of Warren Buffett saying, I'm paying much less tax than my secretary. And I don't know if, well, he trying to give away his money through philanthropy, but still, I think, and now we have this movement of patriot billionaire, I think, who are trying again. So at least, anyway, the issue is really on the table now, front and center. I will ask now Margrethe Jaeger, and we are very happy to have Chrysula Lenung, so you may be able to talk just after Margrethe. Margrethe, you are the Director General of International Partnership at the European Commission. It was really interesting to see how now the European Commission can integrate this and do the job now at home, knowing that there is, of course, EU, the European Commission doesn't have a role on taxation. We know that.
You took away my first statement.
Yeah, so we know that. But you can inspire, discuss. It's about as well practices and converging type of policies. And then the reflection of EU, because of this broader view on, and of course the pro and cons on all member states, is very useful to have your view, even, of course, we will not rely on the decision of the Commission to put a billionaire tax. That said, one day it may happen. So, Margrethe.
I hope that one day will happen on behalf of the Commission, but let me stay on the subject that we are discussing today. First of all, thank you very much, Laurence, for inviting us, Madame la Ministre, Excellencies. I mean, let me... Ça marche? Okay. So let me first say that, we absolutely share the determination of all participants of the Summit for Global Financing Pact, basically, to work together and in reinforced manner, so basically to address the joint climate, nature and development issues in the really reinforced manner, including the taxation part that was identified not only in the Pact for People and Planet, but also in the Nairobi Declaration. Both really called to explore the innovative global taxation options for financing climate action. And we all know that the gap is huge. So what we need to do, we need to close the gap, and we need to use all the tools that we have in our toolbox. So basically, we believe that no country shall ever have to choose between reducing poverty or going into the green transition, or basically preserving planet. And that's why we really, really support the Paris Pact for People and Planet. But having said that, I mean, we need to agree how we are going to do it. So we are absolutely aware that the green transition has to be done in socially fair manner, like the previous speakers has said, to ensure that no one is left behind. But of course, you know, we are a huge bureaucracy in European Commission, as you mentioned, and since we try to find the answer, we normally launch the study. And you mentioned our study that was conducted last year on innovative source of international climate finance, including the fiscal policy instrument like the taxation. So basically, you shared the results, but the study really looked into the potential capacity to mobilize the funding, feasibility, implementation also from windfall tax on fossil fuels to the financial sector tax schemes. And again, the result that you mentioned concluded that fiscal policy and carbon prices are the instruments that can have the most potential to mobilize additional financial resources. So only for the carbon pricing instruments, you mentioned 80, no? I mean, I can say it was 84, but I agree with you that basically it has a much higher potential, and several initiatives exist to support developing countries really to design and implement the carbon prices instruments. Here I need to mention again the domestic resource mobilization and our initiative Collect More, Spend Better that also can bring the partner countries on board. So given the results that I have mentioned, I mean, while preparing for also the Paris Forum, we have decided, having seen the interest, to basically commission another study, and this is a very important one, to see the potential role of the Commission in engaging in the discussion. So you're right, maybe in the future we will find a way to participate even more substantially, but this study will look on all additional options, not only those mentioned in Nairobi declarations, but we are also going to explore a levy on maritime emissions that had been included in the IMO decarbonization strategy, and you mentioned as well. So we are going to continue to work on it, so you have our commitment and really goodwill, because we need to expand the sources of climate funding, including discussing the broadening the contribution base, but also exploring the new mechanism, notably the new global taxes and levies. And personally, I would do everything with my team to continue with Cresula and others to see the options. But basically what we need is to mobilize additional and predictable finance. And here I would like to congratulate Kenya and France to have initialed another follow-up on the work on the summit. And of course, on behalf of the European Commission, I would like to encourage the work on innovative sources and to see, hopefully very soon, the concrete results. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margit. Is that encouraging? Because we need a lot of, because in a way to overcome this sentiment of it's impossible, it's just a way to document that, yes, it is, it's not that complicated, it can happen, this is the amount of money we could raise. So all this is just nurturing the discussion is absolutely essential for many reasons we know well. Chrysoula, now you are here and settled, so I will be very happy to give you the floor. You have been, of course, instrumental in launching all this. And just what is your vision and what the call to other countries, how you see some countries rallying behind this idea of innovative finance, and just to know where you are in your very active diplomatic effort.
Merci beaucoup, Laurence. Dear colleagues, dear friends, first of all, allow me to thank you, Laurence, and the European Climate Foundation for your wonderful job. I'd like to say something that personally, the question of taxation, also as a doctor, I'm not an economist, but it is very dear to me, because when I arrived in France, I remember that the question of the solidarity tax on plane ticket created by President Chirac, it allowed us to finance the fight against HIV and malaria, tuberculosis, and to save millions of lives. So I say that it was, we can say that President Chirac was avant-gardiste, that he thought something like that, but maybe the timing was not the right one. That's why in 2005 we did not manage to scale this powerful idea on the international level. But I'm convinced, and we see for the last year, that the signals are different, and there is momentum, and we have to profit. This is why President Macron had decided to put the question, the question of international taxation for climate and development at the core of the Paris Pact for the people and planet. His analysis was simple. First of all, the challenges that we face are unprecedented. Pardon. Merci. C'est un coup d'état.
We were freezing this morning, and now we have just overheated. So.
Oh, we see that there are so many crises, and from climate change, we see the conflicts all around, the question of biodiversity, after the COVID, the question of health, how we can create health systems. And secondly, yes, it is true, we live in a world, a globalized world. It's a world interdependent, and this comes with benefits, but also with negative externalities. Air and maritime transportation, financial transaction, and obviously fossil fuel production are some of the flows that exacerbate our common challenges. And finally, our current financial toolbox does not correspond to these challenges. Of course, I'm Minister of Development. The official development assistance of France, for example, is very important. We are the fourth country all around the world who participates to these issues, but I can say that this is a drop regarding the challenges that we face. Secondly, public investment is constrained by rising debt levels, and we still haven't found a way to mobilize private capitals. We speak a lot about private capitals, but the results are not there. So if we want to tackle in parallel climate and development, we need massive additional resources. and we need, as you said, Margetta, innovative financing mechanism. And I think that the idea of international taxation mechanism is certainly not new, but as we said, maybe it's the right moment. And some countries pushed it too. As I said, France is one of the pioneers, not only with President Chirac's and Lula's initiatives, but also have a financial transaction tax which partly funds development activities. And I'm happy to say that our countries mobilize 730 million euros from solidarity taxes to fund climate and development action. And I have here another friend and wonderful woman who asks, it's her role, more and more. I know, Nazat, that you push that France go even further. You know, your minister, I think that we give the example. Now the question is how our example can be adopted by other countries. I think this is our responsibility, not only that France can increase our contribute. As you said, Laurence, we need now to scale and the global coordination. I know that many things are moving on the right direction. In Paris in June, 30 countries joined their voices to call for a levy on maritime shipping emissions. This is a new thing. In July, the International Maritime Organization agreed to start working on economic contribution of the sector. In Nairobi, we were there in September. President Ruto insists on carbon taxes and by the very positive reception by most African countries. The Bridgetown Initiative also helped to frame this debate about tax justice and climate equity. But we need to go farther, and we need to go faster, and we need to be bolder. That's why we are working with our Kenyan friends and colleagues, and with the support of the European Climate Foundation to create, as you said, an international taxation task force. This task force has two parallel missions: research, to provide detailed analysis about each option, and of course advocacy, to test the political acceptability of these different options to gather broader support. I'm aware that this is also a sensitive conversation, of course, that one that will need to be led with a cold head, with a clear sense of responsibility, and with a methodical approach. Our final goal for COP30, dear Laurence, and this is my personal objective, is we have 2 years to agree on specific proposals that would then be negotiated in the relevant international institution. I know that Pascal, he dedicated his life for 30 years, they told me, mon cabinet, that you dedicate all your life. And when I said that we have to go fast, we have 2 years, they told me, you know, Pascal dedicated all his life. I say, yes, but 30 years means that we're not going to have a globe. So the Earth will not going to be alive. So Pascal, let's help us also, because you have tips and tricks that we can learn from you. So let me be clear. I think that here our goal of this coalition is not to replace existing negotiation mechanism. Absolutely not. But what we can do all together, we can catalyze and accelerate action. This is what we need. So nobody thought, for example, the G20 and OECD framework on minimum taxation for international companies would happen, and yet it did. And this is why we can and must be confident about this new initiative. And maybe here around this table, they can call us that we are the full-time dreamers. we are full-time dreamers, but we are dreamers realistic, pragmatic, and we see what is going to happen. All of us, we travel, we see that there's not other solution, so we need to convince. And I think the civil society is very important to help this coalition and to push the governments to go faster. Voilà. Merci beaucoup, Laurence.
Merci beaucoup, Chrysoula. And you're right, resilience and stubbornness is really necessary for climate and for taxation. There's like 40 years or 50 years anyway. I am in my 35 years for climate discussion, so I'm not afraid of putting 10 or 15 more on taxation together with Pascal, Gabriel, and others. So it just, we know that it's a long thing. So no worry, we will be there.
New energy. We bring new energy to support you.
Absolument, absolument. Okay, so I will ask now Najat, as Chrysoula just called for, Najat experience and, in a way, focus and drive on because of one organization, one campaign, which has really focused for many years on taxation on financial transaction, and maybe you can tell how you see that more possible. Again, it has happened in, I don't know, I don't remember the list of countries that has established a financial transaction tax. Of course, it's too slow. I'm sure it has opened very, very sort of hot debates when it was taken in different countries, but because of this experience, how you see that now, you see that is the number one priority you will give for that task force.
Thank you very much, Laurence, and thank you for having me in such an important conversation. I'm going to speak, as you said, as one campaign which has been working on development financing from years and years and years. And it's important to have in mind what is our observation, what is our assessment now on these questions of development. For us, it's clear the current financing mechanism coming from the richest countries, from the MDBs or from the individuals, thanks to remittances, for instance, they are not sufficient to tackle all the challenges that we have nowadays. That's absolutely clear for us. When you look at the huge and ever-growing humanitarian needs, development needs, climate needs, and so on, it's not sufficient. Of course, I'm not saying that we should give up, these classical tools. On the contrary, we have to improve them, and that's why we advocate a lot for a better ODA, the reform of MDBs, and so on and so on. But I really want to highlight the fact that there is limits and fatigue on these classical tools. And for me, the right illustration of that is ODA. When you look at the figures, for instance, for ODA, the 2022 figures, they seem high, but actually, if you exclude COVID-19 aid and refugee costs in the donor countries, aid has largely stagnated since 2015. At a time when the needs have dramatically increased, as you know. If you want more figures on that, in 2022, ODA globally reached a peak of $200 billion, but more than 14% of that was for the refugee cost in donor countries. And for instance, aid to sub-Saharan Africa dropped by 8% in real terms. So that is the reality of this ODA. And we have to recognize that there are many headwinds surrounding this ODA because state budgets are constrained, and we know it, which has led, for instance, France to postpone its ambition of 0.7 ODA from 2025 to 2030. So budgets are constrained, but also because political support for international cooperation is decreasing. influential media narratives show growing skepticism of what many consider to be a charity towards less developed countries, with the increasing of inequalities in donor countries. You have, a lot of people seeing this charity as something that should begin and even stop, at home. And in the recipient countries, you have, and you know it, some voices that see this kind of ODA as undignified and, in some cases, post-colonial tool of influence over which they have little control. So that is the situation of this ODA, even if, when you look at the public opinion, the polls and so on, people say they support it and so on, but you have this kind of dynamics around this topic. Around the other tools that is important, the MDB reform, despite all our advocacy for them to be reformed to create low-cost capital, the few slow advances of the recent months, are clearly not yet up to the challenge. So my conclusion is that finally the very form of this international cooperation is questioned. Leaders of the countries of the Global South demand a say at decision-making tables. You said it, Laurence. They are strengthened by their growing geopolitical leverage. In short, everyone feels that we have reached the end of a system, and that in the face of the great challenges we have of our time, poverty that is coming back, or climate change, we must evolve towards a new model of mutual cooperation. A model that would give less the impression of being subject to the goodwill of the richest states and their agenda, especially since achieving ecological transition, which requires so much money in the developing countries, but these developing countries is the place where a large part of this transition are. A large part of solutions, of these transitions are. So this ecological transition, if we want to reach it, it is in the interest not only of the population of these countries, but of all citizens in the world. So yes, we have to invent new models of cooperation, of development financing that would be more automatic and that rebalances power in the governance of these funds. And that's why our conviction is that humanitarian needs and energy transition should be adequately addressed through a common fund that will be funded by taxes on relevant industries. Then the question is, what is relevant industries? So carbon-intensive industries, maritime industries, why not? But we have seen that these two solutions have encountered quite a few difficulties. I don't enter in the detail, maybe in the questions. At one, we have clearly a preference for the financial transaction tax for several reasons. First, because for us it's the fairest. With an explosion of global stock transactions, which have increased by 300 times in 40 years, the financial sector has become one of the main beneficiaries of the globalization. And it's not only that it is the beneficiary of the globalization, it's also that it feeds on crisis. Proof of this, if needed, is that the financial transaction tax in France, if you look at it, its revenues have increased by 50% since 2019 to reach a record amount of 2.2 billion in 2022. The crisis fit this sector clearly. Next, because the effect of the FTT is so modest, very little effect on liquidity, on market volatility. It's a tax with a broad base, a low rate, which does not generate distortions, which brings in high revenues for a modest collection cost, and which has a strong redistributive character, which is absolutely necessary for questions of fairness. To end with that, we worked with academic last year, a few months ago, to estimate what the equivalent of the French FTT or the British stamp duty, if it was extended to the G20 countries, could bring in. So please listen to that. It could bring in up to 260 billion euros a year, depending on the nominal rate chosen. And if we extend this FTT to intraday transactions and high-frequency trading, the revenue collected could then exceed 400 billion euros a year. This is obviously an enormous amount, and I will finish with that, but the icing on the cake would be that it could also promote transparency in the financial markets and strengthen trust. And I think we also need that in this very complicated world. That's why we still advocate for this, Laurence, and I think we should really pursue this advocacy in all appropriate forums all together. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Najat, and thank you to have highlight the governance element of how this revenue are perceived, and it's not asymmetry in decision making, etc. So that beyond the efficiency of the transaction tax. And remember that the Tobin tax was to lessen the flows, and now if we have a totally different perspective, it's just create that as a source of revenues because it's an economic activity, it's different. Thank you. We don't have a lot of time. I want Pascal to come in and then open the discussion. Pascal, if we want the FTT, we need to do a lot on tax havens again. I know you are fed up with tax havens because you have been working so much. But what do you think where you have been doing agreement on tax for many years, how you would take that issue? And again, I will not do any long conclusion because we will not have time. But just to say that when I started working for crafting the Paris Agreement in 2014, the agreement was bent to fail. The assumption where we will fail. So it's not a reason, and you know, it happened that it can work. So I know you see that very difficult. That's why I was reminding that. But how you would help us in a way shaping the process to get there, and many, of course, beyond the IMO, you have been very vocal on asking for. You may have, of course, other ideas to tap on.
Thank you so much, Laurence. And I would start with you saying that global agreements are possible. So we shouldn't start by will fail or let's dream because it will never happen. They can happen. You mentioned the Paris Agreement. On tax, you have at least 2 global agreements. One, putting an end to bank secrecy. Gabriel recently recognized the impact, which is big, with automatic exchange of information. We should do better for developing countries, but it's there. 150 billion euros have been collected by countries already. There is a global minimum tax. We can say it's not good enough. I think it's going to have a real impact, 15%, but it was agreed the first time that you have 137 countries agreeing something in common, which is going to have an impact. It's a global agreement. It can happen. It will bring more than 200 billion euros per year. So once we've said that, and once we've said, you all said it, we need more. We need much more for the energy transition and beyond. I think Mia Motley was eloquent this morning. It's not just the energy transition, it must be more. And we need for that new instruments. I think Najat is absolutely right. It has to go beyond the traditional instruments which are stagnating or failing. So we need to do more. And taxation is one of them. I would just caution on the fact that not everything is on corporate income tax, so we shouldn't overpromise there. There is more to do. Clearly, capital taxation, as highlighted by Gabriel, is very important. Now, the next question is, how do we make sure it happens? Because the reason why there was a big agreement on tax was because the G20 was functioning. The G20 no longer functions for all the reasons we know. It's a fragmenting world and so. So what do we need? We had this steer from the G20. So G20, OECD, inclusivity by bringing other countries, it worked. Now, we don't have the G20. How will it work? And I think that's where you need to invent something which will be a global steer. And in this steer, because we hear the dissatisfaction of developing countries with current institutions, OECD and beyond. I mean, it's about the IMF, it's about the World Bank and all the rest. You need a steer which is a north-south steer. And with a top-down approach, I think we can at least progress some ideas. So we need to do work on substance. I would caution here also that we would be diverted in a pure institutional debate. It must take place in its own merit and place, but we need to work on substance. And on substance, there are many ideas. Even for a former cynical diplomat as I am, I had to compromise and find agreements. But we can dream and deliver. Let me just share a few ideas. Carbon tax emissions, right? I mean, carbon emissions. 60% of carbon emissions today are not priced in the world.
Even subsidized.
60% not priced. The other 40% are priced at €5. What can be done? A lot. And that's where we need to start working. Shipping taxation. I just don't understand. Shipping industry is not taxed at corporate income tax and is not taxed on the carbon emissions. 4% of emissions. Same volume as Africa as a whole. So we need to do something there, and the top-down approach will help. The IMO may do whatever it does. If you don't have the leaders telling them, now we need the agreement, here is the timeline, here is the deadline, they will not deliver. We need to probably work on progressive carbon taxation. Carbon taxation is regressive, it's unfair. And within our developed economies, we could work on that, but that also works for developing versus developed economies. Progressive taxation. Let's work on that. Let's bring the best economists and work on that. But I would go beyond just carbon taxation and include capital taxation. So there is a proposal on the table. I think the merit of Gabrielle's report is to put the issue on the table. I'm not sure that I would go for a wealth tax because I'm not sure it can be delivered, but there is a debate to have on capital taxation. It can start with something very pragmatic, putting at least an end to harmful tax practices on capital taxation. You know, the fact that even France, to attract traders from London, did a régime des impatriés. So every country is not very clean. I mean, no country is clean there. We can do something and bring everybody to the table and make progress and move towards better capital taxation, which is badly needed because that's where you have a big chunk of money, and reducing the inequalities, and we know the crisis of inequalities. And there are many other things. Financial transaction tax, we can keep working on that. It's a difficult one, but obviously there is room to work on that. And beyond what we're discussing, there is the global issue of domestic resource mobilization, but which is another debate. So to summarize, there can be progress, there can be global agreements, there is a need for a political steer, and there is a need for hard work, so 2 years to deliver is good. I spent 15 years at the OECD, so it's not my whole life, and in 15 years, it's still a bit longish, but to put an end to bank secrecy and clean up the very aggressive avoidance of multinational companies, it's still a quite reasonable time, but it's urgent. We need to do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal, for this encouraging word. And at the same time, there is sometimes acceleration in history, as we know. So we are probably at that particular moment. So the organizers have allocated us 10 more minutes max. So I would be very happy to open the floor to everyone. We have colleagues from treasuries here, UK and Italy, but many others that would like to take the floor. I'm sure that, and of course we have the French treasury, of course, but that's natural, no? Because we are in Paris. So I don't know who wants to bring, what I'm looking for, advice on how to start this work. What would be, we are talking about governance, nature of the revenues. We have spoken about, of course, the difficulties. There is a geopolitics thing. We have seen that in IMO problem, like Brazil and China were really deadly, not over my dead body. That was more or less their formulation, almost. So there are all these elements. So advice on who we should mobilize, advice on how to start, given the fact that I think we agree with you, Pascal, very much. It has to come from the top, because if not, there is only the series of impossibilities. We can't do that if there is no decision at the top. And I think that COP30 on one side, the G20 of Brazil are really big opportunities if we introduce the element, but I think Gabriel knows that better than anybody else, on the internal inequality and the inequality of wealth. And that, I think, for, in particular, Brazil, a very important element of the discussion. So happy to hear you, to help us now and maybe beyond that. So I don't know. You want?
Maybe if I can, along the French Treasury. William, do you believe that it's possible, or do we have
You should never ask you should never ask that, Chrysula.
First, I confirm that it is a French agenda covering also the economic and finance ministry for sure. Second, I think what is important, notably for the tax colleagues, is to be sure that we have a critical mass of countries representing the different point of view. This is, I think, very important if we want to have ownership, to start with the critical mass of countries. We need also to think about what is the appropriate platform, and I think it's clear with what I've heard that there is a need to have a political push at leaders level. This is something very clear. There are different ways to do that. We could put in place, and we support that, this task force, of course. Should this task force cover everything? Or should we select some taxes in advance in order not to lose too much time? Could, for example, the wealth tax agenda be discussed between G20 and OECD? I not totally share the view that the G20 is dysfunctional. I think we have delivered these last 2-3 years. Yes, it's difficult, but we can do it. And so I think we should discuss with Brazil about and the OECD about the division of labor, perhaps between this task force and what can be done at the G20 and OECD level. And last point is you need the first thing to do is to put in place a tax. Second element is has it to be earmarked or not? And it's not so obvious. Perhaps sometimes you have a new tax, and then it creates space, but it is not earmarked. So it's a debate, and we have seen that in the preparatory phase of the summit last June. That this question about earmarking is also a key question. So I can of course confirm that this agenda, Laurence, is supported also by the Ministry of Economy and Finance.
I was sure of anyway, so, Minna, please.
Sorry to take the floor again. I mean, it's really great to hear the discussion. I was just sort of picking up a couple of points, particularly on Pascal's point. I mean, I think the G20 still remains a key space for many issues, but I think it is fair to say that there have been significant challenges in the delivery of the global tax agreement, particularly given the US position on the issue and the problems in the US. So I think in that context, I would just sort of point, I think, to the reality, I think particularly with the French here and also the European Commission, that it's really important, I think, that European countries strongly consider supporting the agenda that the developing countries are pushing at the UN General Assembly to have a UN tax convention. And I think we are at a critical moment of time with that, where the negotiations are happening right now, and the European Commission is taking quite a negative view on what the developing countries want. So this is a key moment. And I say that also because I think a change in a position there could lead to more developing countries' support for other initiatives, because there's a sense of recognizing that core agenda and then opening up. Otherwise, I think we see that increased polarization that continues to admit. And the second thing I would just say, I think it's really important that the domestic, as Nadat is saying, the domestic discussions around wealth taxes, other taxes, but that they are linked up. I think it's very important that they're linked up to the commitment of countries which as being a human rights lawyer, I would say is a legal obligation, not just a voluntary one, to also meet their climate financing commitments. So of course, addressing issues within the country, but having that redistributive effect internationally.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Claire McFarlane from UK Government. Thank you ever so much for this conversation, really useful. I'll very quick, agree with much of what William just said. I think we're all in clear agreement that we're increasing, sort of significant increasing in innovative finance is absolutely essential, completely behind that. And we need to crowd in sources as well of revenue and funding from private sector. On that, very quickly, on the CAF review, there's been a focus of a few of the interventions, but also of our minister this morning. I think this is something which is ultimately about doing more with some of the what we've already got, more with our existing resources, as well as the right focus here as well about how you can build on that. But there's definitely more to do there. I think there's an interesting question about the hypothecation. For the UK government, for instance, we right now. We believe treating taxation and spending separately is the right approach currently. That doesn't mean that we haven't got sort of significant focus on reducing climate emissions. We're big supporters of carbon pricing, for instance, and it doesn't mean that we don't want to support absolutely the loss and damage funds and through different ways, but pushing countries necessarily to sort of commit on hypothecation might be something that actually stalls some conversations at this point when we actually need to sort of garner that enthusiasm for raising the revenues in the first place and sort of funding different pots of funds separately. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francesca Utili, would you like to take the floor? You are not obliged to, but it would be just great.
That's very kind. I was more here in the mood of learning where one could find additional sources of financing, but indeed having experience together with William all the progress that had been made at G20 level, I just can add my voice to focus on the enormous benefits that can come from international cooperation on this topic with global rules where you have a common framework so that you avoid distortions, and especially the progress that have been made in the area of tax transparency, I think are extremely promising, as Pascal was also mentioning. And recently, the framework for on crypto assets is another very, very important step. I think that we still need to have more work on two areas. So one, we mentioned aviation taxes, shipping taxes, carbon taxes, where we have distributive issues that need to be very clear in order not to have to lose momentum if one wants to go towards those paths, and then I don't remember the other topic. Sorry. But still, I mean, there's a lot of promising work that we can do in this area. We, as colleagues, have very eloquently discussed there's enormous need of finding innovative resources. So we are really thankful for this work, and we will keep on following it very closely. Thank you.
Good to know we can go back to you and ask for help. You want to say one, Margie, for a last one?
Thank you. No, I would like just to say that I always agree with the French minister, especially when she's dreaming, because she's such a strong force of nature when it comes to changes. And I, again, thank you for organizing that.
You have a fan club there, huh?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's European. But anyway, I wanted to say that we also need to move to widen the coverage of the carbon pricing. It's only 23% that it's covered now. So basically there is a huge room of improvement, and I would also say where the mandatory scheme is not possible, we can still go for the voluntary one. So as a first step, so to go from the 47 countries, to 2 more countries to participate. And then on the very last point, on the optimism, you may remember in 2021, I think, it was 130 countries and jurisdictions that joined this two-pillar solution to reform the international taxation rules, basically to say that multinational enterprises must pay the fair share where they operate. So if that was possible, I do believe that we can also make a step forward our agenda in the next 2 years. Thank you very much.
Just I'd like to add also that this new task force has to be joined, I think, by Brazil. Brazil has a key role for the next 2 years because of the G20 presidency, because of COP30. And I think that we have to work with them strongly.
Working on it, of course. It didn't start well with IMO, but we can have another entry point. And I'm sure Gabriel can help on that and others. Anyway, thank you for this very vivid conversation. It's optimistic. There is a caveat we have to listen to. And maybe I would certainly go back to you, Megna, to say there is a G20 in a way body and the power relation in there, but we need to see who are the champions who are not in there, who could bring their voice to the thinking of the task force. So you can maybe identify the champion. Of course, we have seen Maya Motley, which would be in there anyway. She has announced the big program. But we may need other voices, and so I would rely on you. Good ideas, expert, the governance issue about the task force. Of course, that will be the leaders, so that's where we have to see the balance of views. Very important that we analyze sufficiently enough to demonstrate there is no regressive effect on people, which is not the same of countries, but of course there are the issue of countries. This is really, really, really important. And at the same time, there is, of course, a lot of the things to do. We know that not only carbon is not taxed or very, very low level, but it is subsidized mostly. I mean, when you look at the money, it's just not the same. So that will be a very interesting discussion we had now at G20 every year. I think you have it. But I think that will be the moment just to like the exemption on the, for example, the international companies that doesn't pay any tax to countries when they trade oil, gas, cobalt, whatever it is. But there is the same issue about the subsidies and the way it works. So anyway, a good optimism. I'm really committed to do that. It will be as a bigger challenge as I done in my past. So I'm happy to have new challenges and really asking for help. And hopefully I could keep in touch with all of you just to continue the effort. And thank you very much. And thank you to Paris Peace Forum to have allowed for that.